My name is Vance. I've been living in Chicago for 13 years. I moved here to go to school at UIC in 2006. Something that I love about Chicago is the mix of neighborhoods and how you're able to go from a big city downtown to a really vibrant, active neighborhood with just a few tall buildings or no tall buildings at all, and it almost feels like a slower pace of life, but it doesn't actually feel suburban when you're in those neighborhoods, and so I like how Chicago has this mixture of different urban environments. I am an urban planner, and I work for a company called Morrison Architectural Planning Strategies, or MAPS.
Yeah.
At MAPS, which I also sometimes call MAP Strategies, I do some zoning related work, so I'll help customers with their zoning questions. Let's say they want to acquire a new piece of property and they want to know what they're allowed to build on it. I'll write an assessment and do an analysis that explains the limitations and parameters and basically apply the zoning code to that property. So I definitely think there are a lot of things that our zoning code and our zoning processes do wrong and are anti-development, and I want our neighborhoods to be able to evolve because the neighborhood wants to evolve, not because the zoning code enforces some particular path of change for that neighborhood or a path of not changing in that neighborhood. And so zoning is one of several regulatory issues for a neighborhood to deal with. And it doesn't just affect homeowners, but it also affects businesses. And then on top of that, you have licensing and permitting rules, and so and then building code rules, and so everything comes together. But I think zoning is the last thing that needs to be reformed in that jumble of regulations that control how neighborhoods change or can accommodate new businesses or new people. Out of that jumble of licensing, permitting, building codes, and zoning, like licensing and building codes, they're adapting and they're evolving, but zoning just hasn't kept up with our desire to run the city the way it should be run. A lot of people who apply for zoning changes end up getting them because there's no reason not to grant them the zoning change sometime, except that the map was just drawn wrong or redrawn wrong at some point. And so the map has been almost gerrymandered. I mean, nobody's winning an election because of this, but people are exerting influence by redrawing the map, and it affects property owners. And so property owners have to go through this process that takes a long time. But also the idea that we allow zoning changes to happen on a lot-by-lot basis is the antithesis of planning. And I know that in Chicago there used to be. So I think we can implement some policies that still allow community members and aldermen to have input on how a lot gets rezoned or how a neighborhood gets rezoned. But we also need to have some performance criteria on that as well. So if somebody thinks it's a good idea to rezone a lot, would it also be a good idea to rezone the adjacent lots or the whole block? Why was the lot, or why was that block zoned to the current zone to begin with, and why does it need to change to a new zone? What developments are impossible because of the zone that it is now, and is that really something we're trying to stop? Like, are we really trying to prevent 3 flats from going up in 3 flat neighborhoods? Well, that's really what we've done, or what a lot of aldermen have done by downzoning blocks at a time to zones that don't allow 3 flats to be built, or even 2 flats in some situations. And it's not about simplification, it's about understanding that there are things we don't know, or we're going to change our minds later on. And changing your mind about a zoning code only is allowed to happen every couple of decades. And that's not good enough because it doesn't allow the flexibility that we need to adapt to changing housing, households, family makeup, business types. Like cannabis was not something we thought of in 2004 when the zoning code was rewritten. So we have to think about it now, and then are we thinking about it fast enough to allow cannabis businesses to open on the timeline that they need to open to deal with the state law that's going to go into effect on January 1st. One of the ways that I'm interacting with the City of Chicago today is by being part of a group called City Open Workshop. So it was founded by El Ramel and Paula Aguirre to bring together architects and urban planners, two disciplines that have historically and even in the present day don't interact with each other professionally much, and so that kind of creates projects that address perhaps one side really well and the other side really poorly, either side, and so we're pretty much tackling the same issues sometimes, urban planners and architects, so why don't we bring them together? And so one of the topics that we're dealing with in City Open Workshop this fall and also in previous months is figuring out how to build a coalition around accessory dwelling units, which in Chicago have typically been expressed as coach houses or small rear houses at the rear of a lot. And I got involved with the coalition to re-legalize accessory dwelling units when I realized that Chicago used to allow them and then stopped allowing them in the late 1950s. And so I did some of my own research, and then I wrote about it on a blog called Chicago Cityscape, and other people started getting excited about the idea of re-legalizing ADUs and also were curious why they were banned back in the 1950s. And so that came out last year, and then some people got excited, and then I started a petition to coincide with the election to try to say to the politicians or to the people who are running for election, to ask them, do you support re-legalizing accessory dwelling units? And a lot of people said yes, and so that's a great starting point when you get some people who are running for elections to already commit to doing that, to legalizing them. And then the petition that I created to gather support for legalizing accessory dwelling units wasn't just a way to send to politicians to say that there's this number of people out there, and is this number of people that support ADUs good enough for you to also support ADUs? It was actually better as a way to collect stories from people, because as they filled out the form with their name and maybe their zip code and signed it, and made the number of signers go up from 1,000 to 1,001, they would also submit their personal history about living in an accessory dwelling unit and how much they enjoyed it, or how cheap it was compared to other apartments in the neighborhood at that time, but also how much they wanted to be able to build one for themselves or for their family members. Or some developers even said, I want to build them so I can sell them. And so it was really a great method to collect stories and input from people. So I think out of the more than 1,500 people who signed it, over 50 of them actually submitted a story. And so that's information that you can really take to a politician and use to affect the emotional aspect of creating policy changes. So there's this idea that a corner store in 4 stories is a building and use typology that's not allowed in most neighborhoods, even though it used to be, where you could have in the middle of a residential neighborhood a 4-story building at the corner and a store on the ground floor. That's essentially outlawed because we've redrawn all the maps to only allow residential inside of the main street square. And the ones that still exist can remain, but if they go out of business, nobody else can rebuild a business in that same location. It has to become a residential unit at that point. And so then the community lost an asset. So I think that legalizing accessory dwelling units could be tied to another policy change to allow people to run small businesses out of some of their accessory dwelling units that they build. So the architecture firm called Future Firm, which is Anne Louis and Craig Reschke, they have an idea called Rebel Garages, And they've identified a lot of different ways to affect policy change, or which policies to change in Chicago to allow more small and home-based businesses. And part of it is having space to have your business in. And so they've identified a lot of people who run businesses out of their garages. Garages may not be as ideal as perhaps a brand new construction coach house that is designed, from the ground up to also operate with a business. But the city laws pretty much don't allow home-based businesses to happen in the garage or in a back house. And then it has a lot of restrictions on which kinds of businesses that you can run at home. And so I think that the two policy changes could be tied together to allow people to use their new space to run businesses at home and earn more money, essentially. So in the movement to re-legalize ADUs that I'm a part of, it's important to make sure that a lot of people are invited to participate and to give their input and also craft what the movement is like. And so it's not just me, Paula, and Elle crafting what the movement is like and then making sure that people are on our boat with us as we sail towards legalizing it. It's that they help us decide what boat to get to sail towards it, and who else belongs on the boat with us. And I think if we don't do it that way, then our boat's probably going to sink, or it's either going to sink fast or sink slow. And so by making sure that we have everybody's input, in the beginning, and everybody's involved at the beginning and becomes part of our coalition, then we're going to be able to make it across and make it to re-legalization in a way that actually benefits communities and benefits people who need affordable housing and people who need accessible housing and people who are going to grow old, which is all of us, and have a comfortable and safe place to live.